Yes? Yes? What do you want, Bobo? I know. Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where it's Wednesday. That means it's Epic Comic Book Wednesday. Every Wednesday, I'll talk about a certain comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. Steve Donoghue on his channel will talk about the same comic book, graphic novel, or comic book subject. It is our world's finest team up that we do once a week. And this week is kind of special because I'm talking about Thor. Yes, I've talked about this character before, but this week I'm talking about the whole thing. At least all of Volume 1 of Thor, which ran from 1962 all the way up to 1996, when the Thor comic book was tragically canceled. Marvel canceled Thor for that whole Heroes Reborn nonsense that was happening at the time. Thor, of course, came back, but he was gone for like a year, maybe a little longer, actually. And so I decided on October 5th of last year that I was going to read, I had determined to read every issue of Thor from the first run of Thor, which ran from 62 to 96. And I originally planned to do it in a year's time. It didn't take me that long to read Thor. It is 400 and I think it was like around 430 issues, something like that. It's a lot of Thor. It was a lot. And I was reading other things. If I was only reading Thor, it wouldn't have taken me that long at all. But I read a lot of other stuff at the same time. But I did read Thor every day. I've made a habit of reading Thor every day. And now there's no more Thor from the first run of Thor. And I moved on to the Fantastic Four now. But Thor was really interesting. Thor is not a character that I read a ton of. The only time I really read every issue of Thor every month as it was coming out was in the 1980s when Walter Simonson was doing the book. Otherwise, no. And so I missed a ton of Thor. I've missed a ton. And so it was really interesting to read this stuff because so much of it I had never read before. And that's an interesting thing about reading comic books. You know, when you read a superhero comic book, especially one that's been around for a long time, very rarely did you read it from the start, right? Often these comic books were around before you were born. That was the case here with Thor. And so you miss things, you know. A villain will show up that you've never seen before because he showed up years and years ago before you were reading the comic, or you know, there'll be a dramatic event that will be referred to. You don't know it because you never read it, because you missed that issue. That's how it normally goes reading comic books. But here was a case where I was reading everything. And so every reference, everything I remembered. And I was wholly on board and paying close attention to everything that was happening in this comic book and just following along. And normally, of course, these comics come out once a month. I was reading Thor every single day. So I was reading Thor at a pretty fast clip, you know, considering how fast they actually were published and how quickly people were actually reading them as they were coming out, which will make Steve Donoghue's video today interesting because he was reading these comic books as they were published, as they were coming out. And so that was one of the things I knew I would find interesting when I started this project, and it really was. Just to watch the changes in Thor in this comic book over time and how things changed when different creative teams would take over. And one thing I noticed is that there was quite a bit of inconsistency over the years in Thor, because one thing I think a lot of the writers of this comic book didn't do was read every issue of Thor. So you would have character inconsistencies, you would have things that were just forgotten about, you had all kinds of stuff, you know, that just didn't fit. It usually was minor and you can usually look past it, but sometimes it really made you like, wait a minute. But I think that's just normal with a comic book that runs for years and years and years, for decades in this case. and you have different writers coming on board the comic book. Thor had some great runs and some great creative teams. I'm not going to go over them all because I think that would just take forever. But I will, in future videos, for example, speak about the Stan Lee and Jack Kirby era of Thor, for example, all by itself. Because that is, trust me, a video in itself. Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, of course, brought Thor into the Marvel Universe. When Thor started, Thor was kind of a Captain Marvel-like character, where you had a character called Dr. Donald Blake, the lame Dr. Donald Blake, who was lame in more ways than one. He had to walk. He walked with a limp, needed a cane. And Dr. Donald Blake, while avoiding aliens in Norway, as, you know, sometimes you have to do when you're in a Marvel comic book, he wandered into a cave, found a walking stick lying there, banged the stick against the wall, and boom! Suddenly he had the power of Thor in this spellbinding moment right here. And he sees the hammer here in his hand, and it says, "Whosoever holds this hammer, if he be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor." So Dr. Donald Blake possesses the power of Thor in this first story. Now, this is one of the things that will change in the Thor comic book. And we'll get into that in a second. But first, how did I read all of this stuff? I read every issue of Thor. How did I go about reading it? Most issues of Thor I read in Marvel Epic Collections. Marvel Epic Collections, these big fat volumes that collect classic Marvel comics, there's a lot of Thor Epic Collections available now. Not the entire run. These collections are not published chronologically. And so there are big chunks of Thor's history that have so far, well, not big chunks anymore, but there are chunks of Thor's history, a couple of them, that are just not covered in Epic Collections. But most of Thor is. And so most Thor stories I read in Epic Collections, and I had a delightful time doing it. This is my preferred method of reading classic comic books is, you know, the big fat trade paperbacks. So this was glorious, reading them this way. But not all, like I said, not all Thor issues were available that way. For example, the entire Walter Simonson run of Thor, the greatest era of Thor ever, is not available. They are not available as Epic Collections, at least at the time of this recording. So I had to get those another way, as well as some other issues. And one of the ways I had to do it was with my magic tablet. As you can see here is an issue of Thor. This is issue 370. That is not available in an Epic Collection. And as far as I know, this is not available in any omnibus that I know of. Let me know if I'm wrong or right. But I had to get this all by itself. And so I ordered this issue on its own electronically, because this, fortunately, is available electronically. And I read a ton of Thor on my tablet. It's not the best way to read comic books, but it's not, you know, a terrible way to read comic books. It's all right. This is an issue of Thor when Thor is a gunfighter in the Old West. You have to read it. But, you know, I have a very good sized tablet. I got it specifically to read comics. So, you know, it was okay. It was okay to read that way. Still would have rather read it in an Epic Collection, but what do you do? There were a couple issues, and only a couple, that I had to get the original issues to read them. One was Thor Annual number 12, because I was reading all the annuals along with the regular series, because they're a part of the series. Thor Annual number 12, and Thor Annual number 13, which is fantastic. John Buscema artwork in this. It's great. It's great. So these are the only two original issues that I had to buy for the project. So that's how I read this stuff. And there are really distinct... What is it, Lena? My cat is meowing at me. Why? I'm trying to make a video, Lena. I know. Can you wait? she's going to be trouble. Anyway, the first era of Thor it started off with Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, but pretty soon after Jack Kirby and Stan Lee started, it moved on to a different creative team. And it has to be said that at this point, Thor was not at his best. Like, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby moved on to other comics, and the scripting was done by Larry Lieber, Stan Lee's brother, who, trust me, is no Stan Lee. And the art here is by Joe Sinnott. And Sinnott's good. He's just not good for Thor. He's just not good for Thor. We needed Jack Kirby. And so the very beginning of Thor was okay. Okay to mediocre. There was some pretty not so great Thor stories when Thor first showed up. But eventually Stan Lee and Jack Kirby did return, and they started a series called In the Back of Thor. Actually, it was still Journey into Mystery at this point. Thor first showed up in Journey into Mystery, issue number 83. And eventually Journey into Mystery became the comic book Thor. But as a backup feature, we had Tales from Asgard, where we started getting some of Thor's Asgardian adventures. You see, in the very beginning of the comic book, it was just Donald Blake who thought he was Thor. Or he didn't think he was Thor. He was Dr. Donald Blake, and he thought he just had the power of Thor. He didn't know that he was actually Thor, because that doesn't make any sense, does it? Eventually it does. And in fact, there's a story that you could find in the very last, or not the very last epic collection, but the end of the first run of Thor. There was a special comic that came out, and it has a story in here, Scenes We Never Saw, where Thor, at the very beginning of his career, first goes to Asgard. And at this point, he still thinks he's Dr. Donald Blake and just has the power of Thor. And so he goes to Asgard, and Heimdall's like, "Hail, Prince of Asgard! All within the golden realm will surely rejoice at thy long-awaited return." Everybody's excited that Thor's finally back. And Thor's like, "The guardian of the bridge. I believe he's called Heimdall. He's mistaken me for the real Thor." He doesn't think he's the real Thor. But when he first comes across Odin here, Odin's like, "Yeah, man, you're the real Thor. Trust me, I'll explain it later." And he does, much later. But he does finally explain that Dr. Donald Blake isn't even a real person. Thor needed to be taught humility. So Odin created a mortal identity for Thor. And Thor was stuck in this mortal identity that was just a construct created by Odin, until Odin thought it was the right time for Thor to come back as Thor. And he did, but at the same time, he was still Dr. Donald Blake. It was confusing. And it was confusing for a number of years. In fact, in a way, it's always been kind of confusing. But right around the time that Tales from Asgard showed up, then this comic book started to change from what had been kind of a so-so superhero comic book into an incredible fantasy. And Thor remained that, basically, for the rest of its existence. Thor is a fantasy comic book. It takes place part of the time on Earth and the rest of the time on Asgard or in space or in other planes of reality. And it includes a cast of characters that are mostly immortal gods. You have some mortal characters. You have, Jane Foster, the girl that Thor was in love with, as Donald Blake, and eventually as Thor. But mostly you had Asgardians like Odin and Heimdall and Balder the Brave and the Lady Sif, and of course the evil Loki. And those are the characters that were the most interesting and always stayed the most interesting throughout the whole run. The Asgardian characters did show up fairly early. I think Loki showed up, I think, in the third Thor story. Here's the first appearance of Loki in Journey into Mystery. And so Loki was showing up early, and so was Odin. Odin's giant head, floating head, would show up and talk to Thor once in a while. So you had the Asgardians showing up early, but they sure became a bigger part of the book very soon. And it just became an incredible comic book. And the Jack Kirby, Stan Lee era of Thor, the first era of Thor, just became incredible. And we have this great issue where Thor fights Hercules. Hercules shows up, and then, because not only are the Norse gods real, the Greek gods are real as well, and they interact. And Thor and Hercules got in fights all the time and eventually became best friends and still fought. You know how, gods do. And this initial run of Thor was incredible. One thing I noticed reading this is that even in Stan Lee and Jack Kirby's initial run of Thor, there was a lot of repetition of things that happened. Like, Asgard was always getting invaded. Odin would have to always sleep. He had to go into the Odin sleep for whatever, because, he's so powerful, he needs to get his rest, So Odin would go into his Odin sleep, and while that happened, anything could happen. And Loki was always somehow taking over Asgard whenever Odin would go to sleep. Odin was frequently a dick to Thor. Frequently. Odin is the wise Allfather, but he often made dumb decisions. And all of that was right from the beginning. But it was epic, so you didn't care. Everything was epic and huge. And I mean, just look at that. Look at the artwork. It was just amazing. I know not everybody likes Vince Colletta on inks, but I thought Vince Colletta gave this book a unique look of its own. And you had just some of the most incredible comic book stories ever. I mean, it's glorious. It was glorious high fantasy adventure in Asgard and other worlds. But eventually, of course, Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had to go. Jack Kirby left first. And not all of the replacements worked. Surprisingly, we had Neil Adams showed up to replace Jack Kirby at one point when Jack Kirby initially left. And he's not great. Neil Adams, surprisingly, was just not particularly great on Thor. He wasn't terrible, but his Thor was a little, I don't know, just wasn't majestic. But that's okay, because we did get John Buscema, one of the greatest comic book artists of all time. John Buscema took over Thor, and man, was it fantastic. I mean, that whole run with John Buscema on Thor, oh man. You can't get a better artist than John Buscema, who of course is probably best known for Conan now, for his work on Conan the Barbarian, but he worked on literally everything, and he was amazing on Thor. He was just amazing. I mean, the power, the energy that this book had. There's the Warriors 3 going into action. It was great. I mean, it was great stuff. Great. And so, yeah, in the early 70s, John Buscema took over. But then eventually, Stan Lee had to go too. And we got Jerry Conway on Thor. Now, his Thor was not the brightest bulb in the pack, but still, this was a good era of Thor. It wasn't quite as great as the Stan Lee era, but there was so much good stuff in these issues. So much good stuff, including Suitor, the fire demon, who comes back eventually to cause a lot of trouble. So this was all pretty awesome. And John Buscema stays on the book for quite some time, which I was happy with. But then we got some different writers showing up to take over. Len Wein showed up on the book. And Len Wein is a comic book artist that's done a lot. He created Swamp Thing, for example. He's worked on everything as well. And he took over as writer. And right around the time that he took over as writer, Walter Simonson first came on the book. And Walter Simonson, if you look at that, you can see, oh, this is Walter Simonson. But it looked very different from the Walter Simonson that we were going to get later. This seemed more conventional. It seemed, at first glance, a little bit more like John or Sal Buscema even. But if you look at some of the crazy stuff that was going on, you could see that this was Walt Simonson. This was just Walt Simonson in 1977. Many years before he took over the book and took control of the book. Here he is just an artist, and he's heavily inked by either Tony DeZuniga or Ernie Chan. But still, it's majestic and wonderful. Now, after this period, we got a really weird and interesting period where Roy Thomas, who's written everything, Roy Thomas, probably best known for Conan the Barbarian, Roy Thomas takes over the book. And when Walter Simonson first left the regular comic book series, that was how he left it. And look at that. That's just glorious. But Roy Thomas comes on board and John Buscema returns on art. And this series of stories, when Roy Thomas first came back, was he really leaned into the mythological angle. Now, at this point of the comic book, in the late 70s, Dr. Donald Blake has pretty much been forgotten. And we're spending all of our time on Asgard for the most part. Every once in a while, Thor will go to Earth, but so much of it is spent on Asgard, in Asgard's adventures in Asgard. By this point, Odin who originally showed up in the Marvel Comics with 2 eyes, lost an eye, which he had to give up for knowledge. But eventually he got his eye back. Don't ask me. He's magic, Odin. But then this comic book, every comic book has ups and downs. And after Roy Thomas left, we got some downs. Doug Moench, who's probably most famous now for Moon Knight, I'm going to guess, although another comic book writer who wrote everything. He started doing some stories, and they were not great. They just weren't great. Although, the art was up and down. When it first started, we did have an artist called Keith Pollard. And Keith Pollard was really good. He took over Thor's art for a while. But he didn't stay on the book for very long. But he did a pretty great Thor. But right around the time when Doug Moench took over, we lost him on the book. And we just got some artists that were not great on the book itself. They weren't terrible artists or anything. They just didn't always work. Like Alan Kupperberg got on Thor, and it just, when you compare it to some of the stuff that came earlier, it just wasn't that great comparatively. Also, this knucklehead came back, Dr. Donald Blake, and he was lamer than ever. And I have to say, this comic book, in these issues in 1982 and 1983, at this period of Thor, it just was like, it was a low point. It wasn't the lowest point, but it was a low point. But that's okay, because after those issues, Walter Simonson showed up, and we got not only the greatest period in Thor ever, we got one of the greatest runs in Marvel Comics of all time. Walter Simonson came back to do the art, and he came back as a writer. And boy, is he a good writer. Shh, quiet, Lena. I'm trying to make a video. Sorry for my cat. And he shows up with the introduction of Beta Ray Bill, the alien, who's worthy to hold Thor's hammer. He's worthy to hold Thor's hammer. And doesn't that cause troubles at the beginning of this run? Now, I did a whole video about Walter Simonson's run on Thor, so I won't drag things out too much here since this is already going to be a long video. Let me just say that this is incredible work. And he was on the book for a few years. He was on the book from issue 337 to 382. And there were a couple issues that he missed, but most of those issues he wrote. Eventually, he was replaced on the art chores by Sal Buscema, John Buscema's brother. Sal Buscema is a really good artist, but he doesn't have the status, I don't think, among comic book fans that his brother John did, which is a little bit unfortunate because he was an excellent storyteller and he was a really good artist. And he just does excellent work. And originally he showed up here to do the Balder the Brave miniseries. And he was so good on that they just kept him on Thor. And that lasted, like I said, for a few years. And then Walter Simonson left the book. So did Sal Buscema. And then we got the DeFalco Friends years on Thor, which was really interesting. And Tom DeFalco, Ron Frenz, who had previously worked on Spider-Man, showed up in Thor, and they just did some great issues of Thor. And I mean, they were really good. They weren't this wasn't as groundbreaking as Walter Simonson's stuff. It wasn't as great as Walter Simonson's stuff, but it was interesting. Ron Frenz does have a tendency to kind of pay homage to other artists by drawing just like them. So a lot of his work looks like Jack Kirby drew it. A lot of his work just looks like Jack Kirby showed up to draw the comic. I mean, it's very Jack Kirby. But it's just as epic as anything that had come before. And it was great. They did do an interesting thing, though, in that they replaced Thor with another character. A character called Eric Masterson showed up. And he eventually became the new Thor. This book had some interesting moments. This is, of course, the 90s. You can tell by the Lady Sif's outfit here. That's an interesting costume. I kind of like it, actually. She didn't keep it for very long, though. But we got another Thor. We got a replacement Thor, basically. Thor ran into some trouble, tried to kill Loki, and had to be replaced. And so we got this guy, Eric Masterson, who was a whole other character. He was a mortal who became friends with Thor. Then Thor and Eric Masterson, who was an architect with a bad mullet, they became merged into one character or one person. And after that, Thor was banished from Asgard, and Eric Masterson became the new Thor for a while. And, he had his own special outfit there with the helmet. Eventually, he became his own superhero called Thunderstrike. That's him as Thunderstrike there. Odin made him his own mallet and everything to replace Thor's hammer. And the Ron Frenz and the DeFalco stuff is really good. It was a really good run that lasted a long time. It lasted a few years. But eventually they left in 1993, and then dark times came to Thor. Because immediately, as soon as they left, Thor just was not, it just was not as good. And we get this god-awful cover here, which some people claim to like. It's terrible. Anyway, this god-awful cover of Thor marks a new beginning with Jim Starlin taking over the artwork, and Jim Starlin and Ron Mars. Bruce Zick took over the artwork. Unfortunately, Bruce Zick, well, he's pretty darn good at drawing crazy backgrounds, was not quite as good as at drawing human beings, at least at this period. And so the artwork was, But the really bad part was they made Thor insane. Thor, the original Thor, had just come back, and Jim Starlin decided, hey, let's make Thor crazy. So we took the noblest character in all of Marvel Comics and made him nuts. Yay. So there was that. Eventually, the creative team changed again, and oddly enough, Roy Thomas came back to the book. Years and years after he had originally done it, in 1994, Ray Thomas came back to the book, and we have art mostly by MC Wyman, who is a very 90s artist, and it was better than what had come before, but this is the period when Thor decided to change his outfit to a really stupid outfit, and he had stupid outfits for the rest of the time, for the rest of his time. We're coming close to the end now. Roy Thomas, these issues were odd. Thor is hanging out with a group called the God Pack, who seem like a team of superheroes that you would have found in, a non-Marvel company, Image. They seem like Image comic characters. And I think that's because Image was very popular at the time. And so Thor was hanging out with the God Pack. Thank God that didn't last long. And Roy Thomas's time here in the book in the mid-90s was just okay. And there were moments that were strange. Like, this is one of those times where you get the feeling that Roy Thomas hadn't read a lot of issues of Thor. Like, there was a part where Lady Sif, Thor's girlfriend, on and off girlfriend, comes to live with Thor on Earth. And she's like, damn, this will be strange. I've never lived on Earth before. Yes, she had. She had lived with her on Earth with Thor in Chicago right before the Walter Simonson era. But Roy Thomas forgot that. And then there was, Loki was married, but he got rid of his wife because he hated her. But she returns as if she had never been gone. And suddenly Loki is in love with his wife now. He hates everybody except his wife. He's in love with her. That's not true. Loki couldn't stand his wife. Loki couldn't stand anybody. Loki's a rat bastard. I have to say that about Loki. Unlike the film version, there's nothing redeemable about Loki in the Thor comic book. He's just terrible. He's just a terrible villain who's miserable and hates everybody. He's the worst. And that's why he was great. He definitely didn't like his wife. Definitely didn't like her. Roy Thomas forgot about that, though, or just didn't care and changed it. But eventually, all things must end. And we've got a final few strange issues. And the first few issues were written by Warren Ellis. And the art is by Mike Deodato Jr. And in the beginning of these issues, Thor is sick and dying. And it turns out because the World Tree is being tortured. Yeah, you have to read the story. I mean, you don't have to. But we get skinny Thor. He's very skinny because he's been ill. But he can still, fight with his hammer. But eventually, he loses all of his strength, all of his superpowers, because the World Tree is confused or something and thinks Ragnarok has happened. Now, this is Thor's costume at this period. He has long Fabio hair. He has no shirt, probably because the Enchantress designed his outfit and decided he didn't need a shirt. And he's got his, tight pants. And that's it. That's his outfit. That's Thor's costume. I told you, his costumes aren't getting any better. This period of Thor is odd. I actually don't mind. I don't mind Mike Deodato Jr.'s art. He's very, very 90s, but he's good. So he's a good 90s artist, as opposed to a terrible 90s artist, which you get. But I liked the art. It was kind of cool. The stories, they were better than this, I suppose. They were better than the Roy Thomas stories. They were at least a little bit more interesting for the most part, but they weren't great. And finally, we reached the end of Thor. And we reach issue 502 of Thor. And this is the end. Thor is now wearing this crazy outfit. He's hanging out with Red Norville, who was a character that took over for Thor for a while. A lot of stuff happened in this series. And nothing really happens in this issue except Norville and Thor hang out. And Jane Foster shows up, and Thor talks to Jane Foster, and they're preparing for a battle that in this comic book you never see. It's Onslaught, that miniseries that happened. But this is it. That is the end of Thor. And Thor was gone. Thor was gone. But he was not gone forever. While Thor was gone in limbo, after the Thor comic book got canceled, the Thor comic book actually changed back into the comic book that it had started. It became Journey into Mystery once again. Journey into Mystery, issue 503. And this is actually Thor Epic Collection Volume 24. This comes after this one, World Engine. This is unique in that it's a Thor Epic Collection without Thor. Thor is gone. It even says Thor is gone. This is all about the gods that were left over, like Balder the Brave and all of those guys. And so these characters were still around. Thor was gone. So it's odd. This was an odd time. But have no fear. Thor did eventually show up in his own comic book once again, which I have here collected in Heroes Return. And Thor was written by Dan Jurgens and illustrated by John Romita Jr., among others. And so Thor did return, and he returned strong. We got some really good stuff in this run, which is large. I assume these are going to be reprinted in Epic Collections. They probably will be printed in Epic Collections eventually. Epic Collections are printed in a couple ways. They're printed as classic Epic Collections, and modern Epic Collections. The first Thor modern Epic Collection is this one. This is Reborn from Ragnarok. And this has the 1998 series of Thor. Excuse me, the 2007 series of Thor. I was looking at the wrong date here. The 2007 series of Thor, starting with issue number 1 of that series. This is, of course, by this time, Marvel decided to do a number 1 issue every 12 to 20 issues. So this is the modern era, which started apparently in 2007. Apparently. And I've never read any of this, but I have it, and we'll get to it eventually. But that was Thor, man. It was a wild time reading Thor. It's just great stuff with wonderful characters, and I will miss it. I will miss reading Thor every day. It was a unique reading experience. That's the wrong book. It was a unique reading experience, reading the original run of Thor. A lot of high points, some low points. Like I said, great characters. Balder is one of my favorite characters from this series. He's really interesting. I'll talk more about that character at a later date because I have gone on forever. But yeah, I read all those issues of Thor, and it was wonderful. It was probably one of the most thoroughly satisfying reading experiences of my entire life. So there, I will catch you next time.